Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with another Stronghold Crusader build. You can already see that this video is a little longer, but there were so many tiny details on this build, and even though there are many interesting things in this video, still feel free to jump to whatever part you're interested the most. In the last two episodes I built the windmill and followed it up with an upgrade video, so now that I'm somewhat happy with it, we are ready for the third and final building to finish our bread production. To start things off, let's look at the in-game building. There are two different versions of the bakery, one where the roof is closed, and once the baker is inside we can see through the roof. I'm definitely not going to make the mistake I made in the first windmill video again. When it is active, you can see inside. I didn't know that. And like in every other Stronghold build, I started off with cutting some sticks on my circular saw to 10x10mm to make the basic structure of the building. Just like last time, I tried to be as precise as possible again, for my standards at least, and marked the cutting lines with the X-Acto blade and used my tiny saw and angle to get a clean and straight cut. For the four corner poles I had to cut these sticks to a length of 113mm, so I obviously cut them to 130 first and then cut off the rest later on. That's just the most logical thing to do, right? And at that point I could have gone for the easy option to just glue the base of the roof onto the four corner poles, like this, or maybe like this. But to spice things up a bit, I thought of a new way to connect them. My plan this time was to drill a hole in the center of the poles and put a dowel inside. Then make a half-lap joint with the roof base and put it through that dowel. So I marked the center of the sticks, but when drilling these holes on my drill press, I've encountered a problem. A very common problem. I mean, there's a reason why in almost every woodworking video grain direction or growth rings are mentioned. And to know why this is happening, we gotta take a closer look at the cross section of a trunk first. If we zoom in a little, we can see the wider, lighter colored lines and thinner, darker lines. The lighter ring is the growth period from spring to early summer and it's softer. The dark ring is the growth period from late summer to fall and it is denser and with that harder. Both lines together form one growth ring. And something interesting on the side, I think everybody learned in preschool that you can estimate how old a tree is by counting the growth rings, at least I did, but that only applies to trees in regions with similar climate fluctuations. That means that for tropical tree species or trees with changing available resources, like a tree in the desert getting water for example, counting the growth rings is often not possible or very inaccurate for those trees. That's it for today's biology lesson, and knowing that, we can see why drilling the hole in the center with growth rings going through might be difficult. When the drill is pushing down onto a harder ring, it most likely wants to drift away to the softer areas of the wood. My solution for this problem was to order a new little tool, and it already arrived in the mail today. Are you tired of drilling the holes in the center of a stick in the wrong spot? Are you tired of holding a stick while drilling and injuring your hand? Are you tired of being stupid? Then get the new Fagmagic 2050, made out of high quality precision machined aluminum, steel and scrap wood.
Super strong.
It's so simple, the dummiest of dummy can use it. Just clamp it in. Drill a hole. Boom! Perfectly centered.
Super easy.
Don't wait and get your product now for the cheap price of $69.69.
Nice.
So don't be a dummy, use Fagma. This product does not increase brain capacity in any way or form. Any cost of physical or mental harm caused by Fagma company are not going to be covered. After drilling the 4 holes, I cut the half-lap joints on the roof and used my chisel to cut off the excess pieces. I normally make a sign on the pieces that fit together the best before gluing them, and I used this improvised frame together with my angle as a 90-degree reference to get a square piece. While gluing this together, I remembered something that I mentioned in my first video where I attempted to make the woodcutter, that I would like to introduce a rule to not use super glue or a hot glue gun to connect the pieces. I've broken this rule in every build now, and I'm going to continue to do so in every future build video, so that's that. When the frame was glued together, I drilled the holes in the center of the joints, then glued some wooden dowels into the 4 corner poles and glued the frame on there. I once again used an improvised contraption consisting of my big angle to keep the corner pole upright and my little angle to have a surface that's perpendicular to the corner pole. I did that with all 4 pieces. Some look okay, on others there's a little bit of tear out, but anyways, off with the dowels heads. Next in line are the parts of the roof that I don't know the name of. It's either rake, gable, the first rafter, the first of the trusses, or a king post truss. This is so confusing. I just looked up some pictures online and I don't know what the right terminology for this is. So I'm just calling it the start and end piece. And the chance is slim, but if you happen to be a roof expert, please let me know in the comments what this part is called. I simply cut a stick to size and mark the angles I need, then I cut them off. And after that, mark the parts I need to connect the 2 sides on the top and obviously cut them off again. I went with this version where one slides into the other. The technical term for that would be an open slot mortise and tenon joint, and I glued them onto the main building. And if you're looking in game again, there seems to be another support on the back side of the roof, but only for this side. To stay true to my dowel idea from before, I put one through the bottom of this support beam, or king post if I understood that correctly, even though that doesn't make sense, and another one through this joint to connect it to the ridge going through the middle. Structure wise, this once again doesn't make sense because the whole weight of the ridge would be on this little dowel here, but for this miniature building it works just fine. To make the wood look old again, I did my standard burning and scrubbing with a wire brush so that the building looks like this. For the back and side wall on the building, we can see that this part and this part are made the same way and that the wall behind the oven just consists of simple wooden planks. But for these parts I wasn't really sure what it is supposed to be. Are there sticks woven around these poles, or is it a straw and clay mixture? I decided on trying out something else, something I've never done before, and for that I had to cut some sticks to size and make a groove in the middle of some. Then I made them look old again and glued them together, and I just want to say that I love and hate superglue at the same time. This is what the frame looked like, and I guess you get what I'm trying to do because I've already glued 2 sticks inside. I made the grooves I've mentioned earlier here and here because I wanted to slide 1x1mm sticks inside these grooves. I tried it out with this small part over here that turned out looking like this, and you already know what comes next. Here is the almost finished wall, and you can already see that I've made these cuts here to glue the poles into. Technically I could have added these poles before, making some ridges in every one of them, dividing this wall into 6 tiny pieces and make them separately, but here I cheated a little and the end result looks just the same. To add the wooden boards I simply cut another groove and glued them in there, and now the back wall is almost finished. Yes, I said almost finished because the 2 shelves are still missing. For those I used a thin piece of wood, measured where it is supposed to go and cut some grooves into it so that it's flush with the wall. And to make things a little more fun and complicated as well, you could say, to make it more complicated, I wanted to make some metal brackets. I used this thin strip of metal, then punched a rectangular hole in it with a screwdriver. You shouldn't really do that, but I'm breaking the law today, oh risky. Then I bent the part in the middle and put an even thinner metal strip through both holes. Bent it over on both sides, and now we have a small metal bracket. I glued them onto the shelves, and because this metal part is sticking out here, I made a little hole in the beams. Super glue, do what you gotta do, and I spilled a little here, but that's it for the back wall. I then made the second side, which is pretty much the same, but the only thing I've added that is not really visible on the in-game building, but made sense to me, are these pieces that go across here just to stabilize the sticks a little. These are the two parts side by side, and here they are glued into the building. And yes, the super glue looks a little messy in some areas, but I gotta admit these are two pretty good looking walls. With that finished, I can start with the wooden platform the oven sits on. And as always, mark stick, cut stick, many stick, stick joint. I didn't connect this side because of the corner pole here and added this cross connection instead. Then I used 4 10x10mm sticks where I cut the quarter out of to make the corners of this box, and while I was gluing on the first 3, I thought that I should make one special part that is pretty much the same except these little knobs here that fit into this corner. Next I glued another frame like this on top and the box is beginning to take shape. I made the box look old again and cut out these 2 slots to glue 2 tiny hinges inside here, because I imagined that this wooden box here is used as a storage for firewood, and for that we obviously need a little door. I made the hinges by simply rolling a strip of sheet metal around a piece of wire, and one side I took the wire out and on the other I glued the wire inside. These are working well for this job, but once the hinges are all the way closed, they were pretty far back and the door had to cancel that out somehow, which explains why it is thicker than a Pixar mom. Then I was ready to cover the box with wooden strips all the way around, and this is how it turned out. I've also added a really simple handle out of a bent piece of wire, and I cheated a tiny bit again. I didn't glue any planks onto these sides here, because inside the building they aren't even visible. Now it's time for the heart of the bakery, the oven. This was the trickiest part of the whole building, mostly because it's not square, and I was thinking about how I can make this out of one piece of metal. To get this shape around here was relatively easy. These are just flat parts, and to get this curve right, I used a scrap piece of metal, bent it to mark the distance, and then flattened it again to get the correct length, without having to conjure up the dark
Mathematician demon from hell.
I thought around and measured around and came up with this abomination. This is the bottom piece, these 2 are the back side that I have to flip up, these 2 are the curve and the outer 2 are the walls in the front here. I've also added these 2 strips here that I wanted to tuck under the bottom side to connect it here. This square here is going to be the curve above the opening, and this giant square here was supposed to be the rest round part of the oven. Now I just couldn't figure out how to draw a flat part that can be bent into a sphere. I looked up some examples of a sphere template and they were just too complicated for me to draw, so I thought, I'ma just cut out the big piece and bend it somehow. Yeah, right. This is what it looked like cut out, and I started to bend everything at the right angle. To connect the side pieces to the underside, I used my Dremel tool to drill some holes inside, and then I used these small nails, cut them off and hammered them over, kinda like a rivet. I did the same with the curve over the oven entrance, and you probably already see that the giant square is missing. That's because this was my first attempt of the sphere. I attempted to bend it into shape and tried to fasten it with wire on the back here, but I just couldn't do it. On my second attempt I made a hole into a block of porous concrete, and this material is not known for its strength, so it's really easy to carve. You could even do this with, I don't know, a spoon. I used a normal screwdriver, and with a ball peen hammer I tried to bring the flat sheet metal into shape. I continued on a trunk that I carved out for another project, and this attempt failed too, but on the third attempt I managed to make this not so good looking thing. My method this time was to cut out the shape of the opening on a flat piece, then wrap it around the sides and tie it together on the back with some wire. The bend on the top still didn't work out, so I got it as close as possible, then cut off the rest and glued this cover on there. It is not looking so great, but I still went with it and continued with marking the hole for the chimney. Then I drilled the hole into the top of the oven using a
What are you doing, step?
drill. and everything fell apart again, and now you can see how horrible it looks beneath this cover. So I used the wire closing technique again. And one more thing, I don't really see it in-game here, but normally there is some sort of cover on the top of a chimney to prevent the rain from falling inside. I simply made 2 strips with a cut in the middle to slide them together, made 4 cuts in the top of the pipe, placed the cross inside and glued a flat round piece on top. I didn't really like how the oven looked at that moment, so I've decided to spray paint the whole thing black, and once it dried I used an abrasive handpad to take away the gloss. You can clearly see the difference, and this side here is just more fitting. And that's the finished oven for you. I gotta be honest, this one put up quite a fight. Before gluing everything together, I still had to remove this part of the corner pole here, because the oven didn't fit inside. I did that and tried to burn the wood again to make it look old, but instead I really just messed up the wall on the sides here. But then I thought that this is even more realistic, because the wooden planks near the chimney can be really dark and burned. So I'm just calling this a happy little accident. Then I glued the oven onto the wooden box, and I wanted to hold the chimney in place with some rafters and purlins. Once again, a roofing term that I'm not sure how to pronounce and if it's even the right term for this. But anyways, this is how the basic structure of the roof turned out. The chimney is nice and stable, and because I liked the idea of having a removable wall to look inside the building just like in my windmill video, I did the same thing with this side of the roof. And now comes the part of the build that I was thinking about the most. The oven was relatively easy in my head and was tricky to make, but I just didn't know how to make this roof. In reality, it is probably made out of thin sticks that were bound together, or maybe it is supposed to be a weathered thatched roof, and those were mostly made out of straw or water reeds. Making this out of thin sticks wasn't really an option for me, because I thought that I can't find sticks this small to kind of get the proportions right, and sticks this small cannot be woven around the rafters. But I still attempted to make it out of sticks somehow. So my plan was to collect the branches, if you can call them that, or the stalks of the so-called Tree of Heaven, or the botanical name is Ailanthus altissima. Yes, I know. It is one of the worst invasive species in Europe and North America, and in Germany some call this the ghetto palm tree, because it grows out of every crack in concrete it can find, and it looks a little like a palm tree. But anyways, I collected some sticks that fell from that tree, then I split them into quarters, removed the squishy pith in the middle, and they are relatively flexible when they are dry, but I placed them inside the container that I filled with water and let them soak for a couple of hours. After soaking them for a while, we have this yummy juice here, and as long as they're wet they are pretty flexible. So I began weaving them in between the rafters, and the end product is, it's definitely a look, but just not the correct one. This building doesn't really give me medieval baker vibes. This looks more like the roof of a, I don't know, a swamp witch hut or something like that. But I still made the second side like that and let it dry overnight. The next day started with getting some straw, and I didn't really know where to buy some, so I just went to the pet shop and bought some, even though I was told that it's a sin to do so. Now I'm guessing that rabbits and guinea pigs like the smaller and tender straw more, that's why there's a lot of small pieces in there, but I needed long pieces to make a thatched straw roof. Once I had a bunch of longer stalks, I used some white yarn to make a small bundle and continued doing that until I had a nice row like this. Then I placed it on the roof and used a long wool needle and the white yarn again to tie it onto the woven sticks and rafters. Once the outer layer of the roof was done, I wasn't really sure how to finish it. I needed something that covers up the white strings on each side and that doesn't have any strings itself, so I made this wooden part here where I glued some straw onto. This was definitely not a good solution, but that's how I did it. And after cutting off the excess straw and adding these white strings around the sides, the roof looked somewhat presentable. To be fair, it still doesn't look like the in-game building, but at least it looks like a building that could have existed in the Middle Ages. With most of the main building finished, we can hop over to the other details because there are plenty of those as well. Let's start with the table. I cut some sticks into different lengths and I needed some more, but I was really tired that day, so I tucked the sticks in for the night and went to bed. And it seems that they were getting freaky overnight and now I have enough of them. To connect the pieces, I wanted to do it in the same way I connected the 4 main poles with dowels. But why not make it less stable by cutting a square dowel out of the wood itself? This is how I wanted to do it for whatever reason, and I marked the top of the table legs like this, and oh my god, are my fingers full of super glue. I can't even look at them anymore. Honestly, this is the best method I found out how to get rid of this glue. But anyways, I used my little vise to make the cuts and cleaned them up with a file. The top part of the table consists of 4 simple half-lap joints and I used my X-Acto blade to fiddle out these little square holes, which was pretty annoying. I had the idea to make myself some tiny chisels for specific jobs like this. Maybe in a future video I'm going to do a little forging and make them, but for now it is what it is. To make the square dowels fit inside, I had to make them even thinner, and I mean, look at this one here, does it even hold? I better not test how strong it is, and just glue the table legs into the frame. Then I glued some thin strips on there, and to me it seemed like there are little gaps between the boards. So this is the finished table. The legs are crooked, but it's still stable enough. The next detail is this thing right here. I'm guessing that it's a large mixing container for the dough, and for that one I started off with cutting a slab of a harder piece of wood. When cutting a piece this thick with my bandsaw, I always go really slow because I've only ever broken the saw blade when cutting pieces thicker than a centimeter. So because of the thickness and hardness of this type of wood, I try to be more careful. Ah, gotcha! Next I drew some trapezoids on there, and because they have the same angle I can draw them like this to save material, while keeping in mind that I'm losing half the blade thickness on each side. Now to make this correctly I could have cut this angle on the piece, but that seemed like too much work for me, so I glued them together like this, and once the 4 sides were dry I used some 100 grit sandpaper to make them flat. I later glued the bottom piece on there and sanded off the angle again, and I also made 2 very simple legs. To me it seems that in-game they are at a slight angle, so I sanded the legs as well, and this piece might or might not be here, we can tell, but I've added it to create more gluing surface. This doesn't look right, does it hold at least? That is looking better, and now we have this container and the table that looks like they came in a set together. And to explain this set even further, I made the bucket out of the same type of wood. I started with, who would have guessed it, cutting some strips again. Then I sanded them a little bit so that they taper towards the bottom and have an angle on each side. Then I cut a groove into every stick for the round bottom piece. I started with gluing the sticks around the bottom, and I intended the bucket to look like this, but it seems that it stayed inside the closet because it turned out to be straight. After that bad joke, I cut some metal strips and bent them around the bucket, glued them together first, then drilled 2 holes and used the cutting nail rivet technique again. And at the end I glued the metal rings onto the bucket. Next detail! Next to the bucket is a bag of flour, and I made that one at home on my cutting mat, and I used a white piece of cloth that I sewed together. I think I made the bag this way in the dairy farm video, but I thought I'd show you again how to sew, and I made one side already so I don't make a complete fool out of myself. First put the thread through the eye of the needle so that one side is longer than the other. Then make a knot in the longer side. My grandma actually showed me this secret knowledge of ancient times of wrapping the thread once around the thumb and holding it with the index finger, then rolling the thread between the fingers, pinching it and then pulling it. Boom! Easy knot. In my opinion, the start is the quote-unquote hardest part. The rest is really simple. First poke the needle through the back, through both sides and go around the outside, then poke through again, lower than the first time. This is way harder to explain than it actually is, and we do this to secure the opening, and you could even do this more than once. And now just poke inside this first hole through both sides again and come out lower than the hole before that. Do you recognize the pattern? And that's already it. Just continue with that, and I normally tie a knot at the end by doing the last poke again and not pulling the thread all the way through, but instead going through this loop. Now if you look at the seams I've made, you can see that I never really do this, and normally the pokes should have an even spacing. Also, this is a very simple sewing method that uses very simple stitches, and there are many others, but for this little project my sewing knowledge is good enough, and once you turn the whole bag around, it's even kinda okay looking. Now that we have the mixing bowl, the table, the bucket and the bag of flour ready, we can hop over to the more detaily details, and we're starting with the flour scoop. Making this was relatively uninteresting. I used a piece of scrap wood and this small rounded carving chisel that is pretty dull, and the metal is also really soft. I have different types of these chisels with different blade shapes, but like I mentioned before, if I'm able to forge my own little set of chisels one day, I would attempt to remake the round ones as well. I did the rest of the carving with the X-Acto blade, and it doesn't look too good. The handle broke off while carving, but it can still be used. I actually have a real old flour scoop here, and this is the one I used as a reference for my mini version. Another detail are the bowls on the two shelves. In the game they look like wooden bowls to me, but to make a bowl this small out of wood didn't seem reasonable to me, so I thought about using clay. But clay normally needs to be fired, and I don't know if thin pieces like this would crack inside the fire. You might see here that I don't know anything about pottery, so I just bought some air drying modeling clay that is apparently odorless and vegan. I didn't test if it is actually vegan. I also don't know how I would test that, but I can tell you that it isn't odorless. Normal clay smells like wet dirt, and this smells like wet plastic somehow. Maybe they meant odorless when it's dry, but anyways, making these could not be simpler. I rolled a little ball and shoved the backside of my X-Acto blade in there, a little rolling around, and the small bowl is done. I made a few different shapes and let them dry overnight. They don't look perfect, but that makes them even more realistic, right? Another simple but important tool is the so-called oven peel, bread paddle or baker's shovel, and in your vacation in Italy you might hear something like mamma mia, Stefano, portami la pala pizza, eh! There is nothing special about making it. I measured the opening of the oven, drew the peel onto a piece of wood and cut it out. That's it. Now, one special thing that I was procrastinating, one thing that is different on this build compared to the other ones I made before, is that the bakery has a special floor. I placed all the other buildings just on some dirt in a wooden box, or ignored the floor in general, but if we're looking at the building in-game again, it seems like the flooring is made out of small irregular bricks, and on the side here some are already missing. But because I still have some PTSD from making bricks in a silicone mold for the granary, I used a different approach this time. I still used gypsum as the material, but this time I wanted to pour some into this flour tray and carve out the bricks once it is dry. And I made a big mistake again by buying the quick drying gypsum, just like last time, and I tried to mix it in here. It splattered everywhere and made a huge mess. Then I transferred it over to an old cooking pot, and at that point it already started to set. So overall I made nothing but a huge mess and some crumbly gypsum. I cleaned everything and came back the next day with a dream and a plan. I used a plastic bottle where I cut off the top portion. I also bought this small mixing thing. It's really simple, but it only cost me $4 and I can clamp it into my power drill. It would have been easier to put the powder into the bottle first, but a painter friend of mine told me that the liquid should always be in the mixing container first. So I poured a cup of water inside the bottle and made this makeshift funnel to add 2 cups of gypsum powder gradually while mixing everything. Because of my last attempt I was trying to do everything fast, that's why this footage is looking so frantic, and I dumped the whole thing out, spread it a little, then cut the bottle open and got the rest out with my hands and do a little slapping to make it even.
That's what good pussy sounds like.
And on the next day it is all set and I can just take it out like this. It's not very even on the top, and because the flour tray has this shape it is concave in the middle, but that shouldn't be a problem. I had to rotate this disc around a little to find a spot where the building sits flat on there and marked the corners. Then I simply used an old saw to cut the sides off, and the gypsum was still a little wet on the inside, so I took it home to dry. To carve out the bricks I made a template by using the in-game building and tracing the lines here. On the hidden parts I just made up some random pattern. I ended up with this beautiful piece of paper that I taped onto the gypsum plate, and I started to cut along every brick line one by one with my X-Acto blade. Then I went over all the lines with a scraper again to make them deeper. Back in my workshop I cut the excess pieces off and made some grooves on the edges where the bricks end, and I gotta say I was surprised at myself because this is actually looking really good. Now one small little problem, the bricks of the in-game building have this light grey, brown, beige desert building look, so I still wanted to dye them a little. I was using the scrap pieces I cut off as a test, and first tried the stinky water from soaking the sticks that I kept, but the color was a little too light for my taste. But I also had something else that I kept that makes me seem like a crazy hoarder, but this powder here is the residue of stone and steel of my chisel sharpening video. Back then I poured all the water out and put the grey goo into this glass container, so this color is probably a mixture of sharpening stone sand, steel and rust, and this looks promising. I sprinkled a bit on top and rubbed it in with my hand, and it's looking pretty good. Another happy little accident I had was the gypsum was still a bit wet in the middle, and it turned out giving the bricks this old and run-down look. Now it was time to attach the building onto the floor, and my method was a little tricky and just not a good choice in general. My plan was to drill 4 holes into the floor and drill a hole into the center of every corner pole, but how can I drill a hole perfectly in the center of the... Are you tired of drilling the holes in the center? No, that wasn't the tricky part. I glued some wire inside these holes and tried to glue the building onto the floor, and I thought, wow, this is really easy. Then I noticed that one corner wasn't all the way inside, and if you listen closely you can hear what happened. The funny part is that I didn't even notice it at first and just thought, oh well, this corner here broke off, whatever, I'll just glue it back on. And then you can even hear me gasp when I noticed the big crack. Now I hope you can forgive me for not remaking this part. I just didn't want to go through that whole gypsum mixing, cutting pattern, carving and dyeing all over again. So I just put a bunch of super glue onto the bottom and glued a piece of thin scrap wood on there to hold everything together. It even cracked a second time while I was clamping the wood onto the bottom, but after applying some dye powder again, it isn't even that noticeable. That was quite something, but now once that is finished, I can do the detailiest of details, like putting some flour into the flour bag and shoving the flour scoop inside, putting the white version of this air drying clay inside the mixing bowl to represent the dough, then cutting off a piece of cloth to put onto the table, and I also made some uncooked loaves of bread out of this white clay mixture again and glued everything in place. I also wanted to fill the bowls on the spice rack, and I wasn't really sure what a medieval baker had available, so I just went with salt, made a mess, some paprika, curry, some black pepper, made a mess again, and some flour, sure, drop it all on the floor, and last but not least, one of my favorite spices, some nutmeg. Then I chopped some firewood to put inside this wooden box, and I also made this thing, what I believe is supposed to be a cover for the oven opening. And after putting everything together, I can finally present to you the finished bakery, together with the 3 buildings we need for our bread production, and as always, thanks for watching.